A third type of evidence is testimony. This is a very common form of evidence, especially in arguments from authority or arguments from testimony, because it provides the core of that argument. And for anyone who's ever quoted somebody, that is essentially what they're doing, is using testimony as a form of evidence. And the reason testimony gets used is that it's very strong in establishing credibility through some other respected source. So what we're doing when we use testimony as evidence is to borrow that credibility of that source and support our own argument, because that respected source says something that is similar to what we have to say. It's just that they tend to have more credibility about it. So if they agree with what we're saying, then we can have that credibility too. And if you look at how often testimony gets used, you see that even sources that might have their own credibility will borrow from someone else. For example, one of the speeches that I'm going to show for an example of using testimony is from Senator Maria Cantwell, who's from my home state of Washington, and she's talking about the need for renewable energy sources. And she does that by referring to an expert in the field of energy who talks about why renewables are going to be so important in relation to the decline in the availability of oil. So she's using the same idea of borrowing credibility from a respected source, someone who's studied the issue, knows the ins and outs of it, and she's incorporating that into her argument about why we need to invest in renewable forms of energy. But there's another way that we can actually use evidence that's a little bit different. And the example I have of this is Edward R. Murrow, the famous news guy who helped take down Joseph McCarthy. In one of his programs, when he was taking on McCarthy, he quotes Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare wasn't necessarily an expert on communism or government or anything like that, but Shakespeare had a way with words and a way of understanding human issues and expressing those. So Murrow applies the quote from Shakespeare in an effort to illustrate his point about what McCarthy is doing and what it means for the country. So you see a couple of different ways that testimony can be used, both borrowing credibility in some way. The one is more borrowing expertise, the other is borrowing credibility in the sense that here's a way of putting together the words that makes sense, it's very powerful, and it illustrates the point that I'm trying to make.